we thought we would do is lay the foundation for how the law operates around immigration nationally and how it plays out in Massachusetts. And I'm going to start out by sort of going through some slides that sort of just take us through the government agencies that are involved in immigration, how the law works at a sort of high level. And Irene is in the trenches every day, going into the detention centers, giving her 150% every day to help immigrants who are unjustly, most of the time, detained, who need relief. And that's what PAIR and many other nonprofit organizations do, is provide pro bono assistance to immigrants in detention. Then we really want to personalize it, take your questions, give some context, answer the questions you might have, so that we're not just lecturing, but it's more an interactive experience. Does that sound good? Okay, great. So after 9/11, the immigration agency was reorganized in the United States, and the Department of Homeland Security was formed. And so that's DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and it has within it that deal with immigrants. CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection. They're the folks that guard the borders and staff the airports and border crossings, and they are the people who talk to those seeking to enter the country to determine if they will be allowed to enter or not. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is the enforcement arm of the Department of Homeland Security. They are, in effect, the police of the Immigration Service. And they are responsible for initiating removal proceedings, detaining people. They're the ones that go around and raid companies and other institutions to detect people who are in the country that they feel should not be here, to initiate removal proceedings. And then USCIS is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and that's the benefits granting arm of the immigration authorities in the U.S. So that's the Department of Homeland Security. And then we also have other aspects of government of the United States, institutions in our government that deal with immigration. The State Department deals with the consular officers, but Department of Justice, that government agency where, the U.S. Attorney General sits at the top of it, is actually the agency within the federal government that has responsibility for the immigration courts and the immigration judges, which is a very unusual setup, and we'll talk more about that as we go along, but the independence of the judges is an issue to keep in mind, because our immigration judges are not entirely independent, because they work under the auspices of the Department of Justice, which controls the prosecutors, those that are seeking to remove people if they believe that they shouldn't be here. So some basics about how people can come to the United States. To be admitted into the U.S., a person has to either be a U.S. citizen, a lawful permanent resident, that's a green card holder, someone who holds a visa to enter the country, a refugee or an applicant for political asylum, or have some other special document that's been issued to allow the person to enter. Asylum seekers who flee persecution from abroad, who are detained by CBP or by ICE, are entitled to something called a credible fear screening. And if they pass their credible fear interview, then they're permitted to remain in the U.S. application for political asylum. And in that case, if they're detected at a border crossing or at an airport and they ask for asylum and pass a credible fear interview, they're going to present their case before an immigration judge. Refugees are people who have been processed already outside of the U.S. and have been vetted and approved for refugee status. So when a refugee arrives in the U.S., that person and his or her family have already been pre-approved for a status to be here permanently in the U.S. In either case, if someone comes as a refugee or if they request asylum, they have to prove either that they've suffered from past persecution in their home country, or that they have a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of one of 5 factors. There could be more than one, but you need at least one of these: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And the persecutor be the government of the person's country, or it could be private actors that the government is either unwilling to control or incapable of controlling. Think about gang violence in Central America, the ability of the government to control those gangs. And the applicant for asylum has to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the person making the decision that he or she wouldn't be safe no matter where they would go back to in their country. So it's not just the county or city or region of the country that the person is from, but any other place. So there's 2 different ways for someone to seek asylum. If someone has come into the U.S. on a visa and been admitted into the United States and isn't in ICE custody or in an immigration court in removal proceedings, then that person is able to file their application for asylum, what's called affirmatively, with the asylum office instead of with a court. And they would be interviewed by an asylum officer and wait for their decision. If someone has been apprehended or has been accused of not being here legally by one of these agencies that deal with immigration, including people who just present themselves at the border and say, "Please help me, I want to apply for asylum," then they will be going through what's called a defensive asylum process, where they have to make their case in front of a judge. But first, they have to make sure they can pass what's called the credible fear interview. That's an interview that's a preliminary step that an officer will undertake to ask them whether they have a reasonable or significant possibility that they would be able to prove persecution, either past persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution. So there's a lot of things happening these days about credible fear interviews, the way they're being done, especially at the southern border, or not even done, being put off in many cases, is a big area of controversy that we can talk more about later. But the law requires that they be given this credible fear interview, and the standard to be approved for a credible fear interview is lower than the asylum standard. So more people will pass a credible fear interview than will ultimately be approved for asylum. So if they do pass the credible fear interview, then they're allowed to stay in the country and apply. Have 1 year time of entering to make their application for asylum. If they don't pass the credible fear interview, then they will be removed from the country summarily through something called expedited removal, which is a very quick removal process where you don't even go in front of a judge, and the immigration officer himself or herself has the right to carry that out. So people at the border who pass the credible fear interview are being treated in varying ways inconsistently right now, especially at the southern border. They are either held in ICE detention centers, or their cases proceed through the courts. And I'm sure many of you have read about what some of these detention centers are like. They are not, oftentimes, they're not comfortable, they're not safe, and they're not appropriate in many cases.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Could you go back to the previous frame?
Yeah.
If they're not approved
Yeah.
On a credible fear basis, they nevertheless go before a judge before they're deported? They can?
Well, an expedited removal, they often They often aren't. They're often, during expedited removal, they're often just removed by the ICE officer or the CBP officer.
So some examples are, to make it more human, somebody might come to the border and say, they're caught at the border, they've crossed the Rio Grande, they're on their way into Texas, and they get picked up by Customs and Border Protection. And they are brought in for an interview, and they're asked, why did you come into the US? They might say, I just was coming for a better job. I couldn't earn enough money to support my family in Mexico. I did meet a woman who's had this experience. She was not afraid of living in Mexico. She was not being persecuted. And so she was essentially sent right back over the border. That was, she was given some paperwork, expedited removal. She could not establish credible fear. There are people that are afraid of where they came from. They fled because they were persecuted, but they don't convince, during the interview, they don't convince the person interviewing them that they have a credible fear. We sometimes have those people in detention here, and they're allowed to go to a judge and appeal the credible fear interview decision so that they can then hopefully obtain a positive result and then seek asylum.
Along that line, the intervening potential other countries of asylum, for example, a Guatemalan goes into Mexico, he no longer has to fear the Guatemalan gangs, but he's in Mexico. Does Mexico provide the equivalent of asylum and refugee status? And I guess then I saw some stuff on these caravans where a woman said, geez, I should have stayed in Mexico, and the border was so tough with the U.S., I should have just stayed there and sought asylum there. How far, I guess that's the question. Does one could simply, in another world perhaps, seek asylum in the closest place which might afford asylum?
Right.
Why go through Mexico to the United States when Mexico effectively insulates you from the Guatemalan gangs?
So one of the, no, it's a good question. One of the questions on the asylum application for any individual who applies for asylum is, what countries did you pass through on your way to the United States? Did you have lawful status there? How long did you stay? So we have many, many clients that come from Central America, and so they might say, well, I passed through Guatemala, El Salvador, let me get my geography right. Like I have a client right now from Nicaragua. He went from Nicaragua to El Salvador to Guatemala, to Honduras, Guatemala, and then Mexico. He did not feel safe anywhere. There are gangs, there's a violence. He crossed through them. He crossed into Mexico from Guatemala, left his family to get food and water, was arrested by the Mexican police, put in jail for 3 days without food, water, was robbed of all his money, and then the police left him and said, if you report us, we'll kill you. He then was stranded for 2 months in Mexico before he got to the US. He hasn't seen his family since then. That was 8 months ago. That's not an atypical scenario. So a lot of people are not seeking asylum in other countries because there's crime and they don't feel safe. They don't feel safe until they get to the US border. But it is a possibility. And I've just heard anecdotally in the news that many people in the migrant caravan are staying in Mexico because they have found a viable solution to their housing and their needs in Mexico. I think it helps if they have relatives or friends to stay with. But anyway, that is one of the many hurdles that people have to pass through to seek asylum, is to show that they did not have the ability, or they did not actually have lawful status in another country.
Yes.
Yeah, could you briefly touch base on this credible fear interview? Who administers it, and time frame? How long might it take, and what actually is involved in the interview?
I can speak a little bit to that, and Irene, I don't know, you can also. I know that they're supposed to be conducted by people who have knowledge of asylum principles, but I also know that it's not always the case that the people who have the knowledge are conducting them. Supposed to go to someone within ICE or CBP, to a supervisor, someone who has experience and been trained on how to detect whether someone is likely to be able to prove what they need to prove to pass a credible fear interview. But a lot of people right now, to your point, are coming up from the southern border through Mexico, and they're actually being turned away right now, and they're not being given credible fear interviews, even some of them. They're not even allowed to speak to an officer. They're doing something called metering. So have you read about that? Do you know what that is? So only taking, 25 people at most a day, saying they don't have capacity to process people. I was just there 2 weeks ago, and I was in a shelter in Ciudad Juarez where there are like 1,000 people waiting to present their cases, and they're not able to actually present their requests because they're being told, right now at the southern border we don't have capacity to even do credible fear interviews for everybody. So they're actually being told to wait weeks and weeks and weeks sometimes on the Mexican side before they can even make the crest. But someone who is supposed to have the expertise is supposed to do the credible fear interview.
I've read many transcripts of credible fear interviews for our clients, because generally our clients at PAIR have passed their credible fear interview. They're seeking asylum. And a transcript generally reflects maybe an hour and a half conversation, an interview with a translator if needed, or interpreter if needed. And the questions typically go through what you would expect to assess whether the person fled on the basis of fear, whether they have experienced persecution by the government, by a private actor. At the end now, the newer form has boxes to check, like did this person experience persecution on the basis of political opinion or race or nationality? Did they experience past persecution? Yes or no? Do they have a credible fear of future persecution? Yes or no? So the ones I've seen, there is certainly an attempt made to assess whether the person has credible fear. Now, I have not experienced personally, I have not seen an interview where there was not a credible fear found. I probably have, but I don't remember one. But the ones I've seen they do reflect a process for people that do make it to a credible fear interview, a process to assess initially whether the person has a real fear, and that's what led them to come to the United States.
It's the way it's supposed to work. And this,
Is there any evidentiary aspect to this? I mean, if some guy comes in and he's badly beaten up and scars all over the place, one could say, heaven only knows where those were received. But I guess the question is this involve a simple self-reporting
for the
of a
credible
story?
at the credible
The
fear, yeah.
credibility of which must be assessed by the judge. Is that fundamentally?
It's not in front of a judge for the credible fear. It's an officer.
But I mean,
No, but they get
fundamentally, is this an issue of the determination of a fact? What are the facts?
Right, so
The
that
person says something, someone has to make an assessment as to whether or not that's
right.
credible.
So there's a subjective determination, from what I can tell, made by the interviewer as to whether somebody has a credible fear or not. Facts are not found, but if they pass that threshold determination that is subjective, it then goes, they get a chance to present their full case to the judge.
But it is in fact self-reported, and there's no evidence that necessarily is prepared or forwarded other than the narrative. Is that right?
Correct.
That's right.
Okay.
But there's a much lower percentage of people who actually win asylum compared to the number who are approved for credible fear.
One thing we do see in credible fear interview notes is that there's often sloppiness where the interviewer cut and pasted from a prior interview and described somebody as speaking Spanish when they actually speak a language in Africa, or describing somebody as female when they're male. And then when they get to the judge to present their asylum case, the judge holds them to whatever was said at the credible fear interview. I mean, obviously, if somebody is from Africa and not from Guatemala, the judge will see that. But if there are any inconsistencies between the testimony at court and the credible fear statements, that could kill an asylum case.
I mean, no offense, but fundamentally what you're saying is if you're a consistent, persuasive liar, you have a good chance. No, because you're simply saying.
No, that's not what they're saying.
Well, no, I'm interpreting it that way. What I'm simply saying is, somebody's coming and telling you a story, and believe me, I understand that there are many reasons, but sometimes the stories may be true, and sometimes they may not be true. Forgive me, my question is, how does one assess credibility in those circumstances? that's a tough thing to do.
Would
I
you
mean,
like us to talk?
I pity
Would you
people,
like to
but
hear what we
I'm
have to say?
saying that's a tough thing to do.
Would you like to hear what we have to say?
Sure.
So a judge in the asylum, the immigration courts here will not grant asylum unless they have looked at all the evidence that's presented, corroborating evidence, statements, supporting statements from other people that are familiar with the testimony that's being provided. They look at expert reports, forensic medical reports, psych evaluations that are performed. I mean, we submit huge amounts of evidence and documentation to support a claim, and even then it's an uphill battle to get asylum. So there's lots and lots of evidence and proof presented to the judge. That's a completely different process than the credible fear interview, which is really a short interview that relies on the interviewer to make a judgment just to see if that person passes the threshold to get into the court system.
And also, I think it's important to understand there are organizations that are dedicated and have as their mission assessing asylum cases before making a decision about whether or not to represent people. For example, we are here representing PAIR, the Political Asylum Immigration Representation Project, and people are often fortunate to find PAIR, but there are many organizations like PAIR that are very careful to do assessments and intakes at the beginning when someone comes in and tells their story about what happened. And if the person doesn't make the cut because there's inconsistencies or there's things about what they said that doesn't seem like it's a proper story, there's just doesn't add up for whatever reason based on all the experience the organization has with the country conditions, similar things that have happened to other people in other countries, in that country. They won't be accepted, for example, as a client with some of these organizations. Now, there are lots of people all over the country applying for asylum. Many don't have the benefit of this kind of, assistance like we give at PAIR. So there's different organizations that people go through, and then many people can't find an organization or can't find help, and they're just out there on their own, and they file on their own. So, there are all kinds of people in the world, and there are some cases that might not be valid, but there are a lot of cases that are. What we are here to talk about are the ones where we know that, at least in our experience, we can say this person meets the threshold criteria to be granted asylum, and then what happens to them, there are many people that don't, but, we work with people who we believe do. Yes.
Are there any statistics as to the number of credible interviews that are approved?
Yeah, I think it's about a 71%, but of that percentage, like a just tiny percentage would, especially if they're not represented by counsel, would ever actually have their case approved. A very, very small number. We're going to have some statistics in our slides if we can get to some of them. Can give you. And I wanted to actually turn a lot of the presentation over to Irene. But these are the things that happen to people when we'll be right with you in 1 second. When they cross the border, they could either be held in detention, they could be released on parole, especially when moms and children are entering together, released on bond, which means the judge has to agree that they're not likely to flee or abscond, and then that they set a bond amount that the person can actually afford to pay. Then they'll be released sometimes with, ankle bracelets or other things to monitor them, and or they can be released sometimes on their own personal recognizance. And well, take your question, then I'm going to turn it over to Irene. Yeah. Yeah.
My hearing is a little delicate. I don't know if the microphone is turned on.
No, the
Uh,
microphone is just to
working at all.
for the,
Okay, thank you.
but I can turn the mic up a little bit. I can get some amplification.
And we can shout. Okay.
Keep on going. The slides are there.
Okay. Is that better? Any better?
You won't be doing that.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Why don't you take over?
Okay, how's that?
Well, we're getting a level. The audience,
Thank you.
if you spoke up a bit, that'd be good.
Okay, so we're going to save the rest of questions to the end so we can get through the slides. And we actually don't have that many slides, and we know you have a lot of questions. How's that?
Nope, it's actually not set up to project, it's more for the recording that
Carry on.
Okay, so where are people held in ICE detention in Massachusetts? And remember, ICE are the people, like the immigration police that go out and pick people up who are undocumented. We have 4 county jails in Massachusetts that hold ICE detainees. And these are the Suffolk County House of Corrections in Boston, that's right off 93 South, just south of Boston Medical Center, near the South Bay Shopping Center. There's the Plymouth County Correctional Facility in Plymouth, that's right off Route 3 in Plymouth by the rest area that has the big totem pole. The Bristol County Jail, I don't know if you go to the Cape very often, but that's what I think of when I go to the Cape. Right near that rest area by the McDonald's is actually a place that houses ICE detainees. The Bristol County Jail in North Dartmouth, Mass., and the Franklin County Jail that's out in Greenfield, Mass. So each of these facilities has a contract. The county has a contract with ICE, and they are paid a certain amount of money per bed by ICE to hold a detainee. Suffolk County, there are 2 different units. They're separate. The ICE population is separate from the criminal population. Plymouth has a bigger facility, maybe 4 units of men. Sorry, Plymouth is only men. Suffolk County has a small women's unit. Otherwise, the units are male. Bristol County has large rooms, like think of an airplane hangar full of bunk beds. Those where the ICE detainees are held in Bristol County. They also have a women's unit. And the Franklin County Jail in Greenfield has a smaller unit, and it's a mixed population of ICE detainees and population. So just a refresher, who are the people in our county jails? Right here in Boston, right over in Boston, these 4 different facilities, you will find asylum seekers who've been transferred from the southern border. You will find undocumented immigrants from our communities, people you may have acted with at some point in time. They might have gone into they might have a traffic violation. They're picked up and discovered to be undocumented. They're put in one of these jails. Sometimes you will find, often I find in these jails, individuals who've been ordered removed. So they already have a deportation order, but ICE or DHS has not yet been able to obtain a travel document from the individual to return them to their home country. Most of these facilities, as I mentioned, there are a few women, and there are no children. So as far as I know, and I think I would know this, Massachusetts is not detaining children. You go to the next. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the immigration court process. The immigration court in Boston is located in the JFK Federal Building. These are some of the nuts and bolts of how immigration works. I've only been doing this work for a couple of years. I didn't know any of this, so this is what I have found incredibly interesting, so hopefully you'll find it interesting too. The Boston Immigration Court, it's on a couple of floors in the JFK Federal Building. It's an office building. You go in, lo and behold, if you go behind some doors, you'll find courtrooms with judges in black robes and many, many, many immigrants waiting to be heard. Terrified looking people, I should say. The detained docket that means the docket of people whose cases are being heard from detention. Those in our 4 county jails will wait for their case to be heard. It usually takes several months. The non-detained docket, so several months from when they arrive in the jail and if they're seeking asylum, when their claim is heard on asylum. So they'll spend those months in jail. If their case is appealed one way or the other, they could spend another maybe 8 months in jail waiting for the appeal to run its course. So the non-detained docket in the immigration court consists of people who are in removal proceedings, who are not in ICE custody. So you remember we had people who get out on parole, who are released on bond, who were released on an order of their personal recognizance, or somebody who's picked up who's undocumented. They might be given what's called a notice to appear. That's like a complaint by our government against them saying, you came to the U.S. on such and such date, you didn't have a lawful document allowing you to come into the United States, you're actually a citizen of Guinea, and you have violated such and such law, and we, the government, want to remove you. And that's why we call these defensive proceedings. Anybody in the court system is responding to a complaint against them, and they have to show they have a legal basis to be here. So that legal basis we'll actually go to before you go to the next slide, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll get to that. But immigrants who are represented by a lawyer are 5 times more likely to succeed in their application, 5 times. And it's also extremely difficult for immigrants to access counsel. Detained immigrants in particular have a very hard time getting attorneys, and non-detained immigrants have more access to attorneys, but attorneys are extremely expensive, and mostly people are not. If you go to the immigration court on any day, you'll see that most immigrants are there without counsel. Immigrants have the right to counsel, but they have to pay for it. So unlike our criminal defense system in this country, where you get a free public defender if you need it, here immigrants have to pay for counsel unless they can find counsel that's pro bono.
What is the subtle distinction there where a criminal defendant has a right to counsel paid by the government, but these folks don't have a right to counsel paid by the government? What's the distinction?
So we're holding questions to the end so we can get through the slides. The distinction is simply that in a criminal context, the government pays the lawyer. In the immigration context, they don't. That's the distinction.
The Supreme Court decision determined that, and this could change in the future because there's a serious liberty interest at stake now with immigrants, much more so now that there's, so many hundreds of thousands of people being held in detention. I just want to make one quick point before you move on. I think it's really important that everyone understand that many people who are in jail have never, ever committed a crime. They're being held because a particular administration might have a policy to hold people in detention, whereas under other administrations they might not have been held in detention. They might have been allowed out with a court date. So I think it's really important. There are some people who may have committed crimes, but a lot of the people who are being held in detention are simply people who have fled persecution in their home country. So I think it's important to understand that.
Okay, so I spend a lot of time representing detained immigrants. So I want to give you a feel for what it's like to be in the detention center, and I'll talk about what Susan just mentioned. When I go into the jails to visit my clients, they are, as Susan said, I don't know if you said this or not, but they're in jail. I mean, the floor that they're on is a regular floor, just as criminal defendants would be in, except in most cases they're not mixed. But they are living in little cells, tiny little cells, 2 beds. They get free time to roam around a common area for several hours a day. They might get to go outside into a basketball court in a caged area with chain link fence for an hour a day. But otherwise, they're spending their time effectively in jail. So we go into the jails and screen people to find out whether they're eligible for any kind of potential relief, whether they're possibly eligible for pro bono counsel. And the types of relief that we are screening detained immigrants for include bond. So bond, and I'm going to give you examples of each of these with real anonymous clients to try to put a face to these. So we're looking to see if people can get out on bond, asylum, protection under the Convention Against Torture, cancellation of removal, and habeas corpus. So I'm going to give you examples for each one. Bond is like bail. You see if you can get the person out by having the court allow them to pay money, and then they are released, and then they pursue their claim while they're out. The significance of bond is that the person doesn't have to sit in jail while their case is being resolved. They get out, and the time, I don't know if we mentioned this, but the time to get through your case in the immigration court if you're not detained is maybe 3 years, 3 or 4 years. So once you're out on bond, you have a lot of time to prepare your case. If you stay in jail, you're going to have your case heard in about 2 to 3 months. Let me give you an example. I had a case for a man who was in Suffolk County. I met him one day. He was from Honduras. He had fled to the United States because his father had been gunned down by the police in Honduras. His uncle had been gunned down by the police in Honduras because they had tried to, this is what he told me, they had tried to force them to sell drugs. The police were working with the narco traffickers. Both my client's father and uncle refused, and they were gunned down in the presence of my client. He felt his life was in danger. This is a fairly typical scenario. So he decided he had to come to the United States for safety. I asked him, what did you think about the wall? Did you hear about the wall and our president wanting to keep immigrants out? He said he thought the wall existed, but he was simply going to get to the border, figure out how other people were getting up, over, or under the wall, and do whatever everybody else was doing. So he was not at all deterred by the concept of a wall, and he felt he had to save his life by coming to the U.S. So he came across the border, passed a credible fear interview, and was transferred to Boston because Boston happened at that moment to have a bed available for ICE. So that's what happens. We call them border transfers. There's a bed available. They get flown on a plane, and they end up in Boston. We've had clients that have never seen snow before from Africa, and they're just agape looking out the window at snow falling. So I meet him in Boston in Suffolk County Jail. He was eligible for bond, and he was released on bond. I think he had to pay something like $3,500 maybe, and he was able to get the money from family members. And he then once he was released, he went to Louisiana where he had a relative, and so now he's going to be in the court system for the next few years living in Louisiana. I had a woman who I represented in bond proceedings. I met her also in Suffolk County. She had come from Africa, she was fleeing female genital mutilation and forced marriage, and among other things. She was anyway, it's a long story of how she ended up in Boston, but Boston was completely random for her. Here she was all the way from Africa. She was absolutely terrified. She had never been in jail before. She came from a distinguished family in Guinea, and she was distraught that she was in jail. She didn't know what was going to happen to her. She was desperately afraid. She was afraid of losing her mother, and I thought she was going to get on a plane and go back to Guinea. She was so terrified, but we represented her on bond, and she was released. She has now been out for a year. We asked for her, the last time I was in court for her, she's now on the non-detained docket, which is a slow docket, but she has a good case, and we want to get it heard. Before the government shut down in December, I asked the judge to give her an expedited hearing. So he set the hearing for January 9th, 2019, but that was during the shutdown. So the hearing didn't happen because the immigration courts, ironically, were shut down. So no cases were being heard. And after the court opened up, I got a notice in the mail that her hearing has been reset for November 20th, 2021. So now she's going to be sitting until November 2021 until I get the court to move up her hearing date again. Okay, asylum. We have many clients that we represent in asylum cases who are sitting in detention, and here's an example. Last summer, I met a man in detention in Boston. He had been transferred from the border. He and his family fled El Salvador. The man was a police officer, and he had done everything he could to protect his family from gang violence and to resist corruption. He had been repeatedly told, if you accept money from the gangs, accept money from this person or that person, and do this and that, you'll be safe. But he refused to be corrupted, and I could not believe the amount of violence he was exposed to in trying to protect his family and trying not to flee. He did not want to flee. None of our clients want to flee. They all want to stay in their home countries. At some point, it was absolutely clear that they were going to be killed if they did not flee. His wife had been brutally beaten. His small children had guns put to their heads. Finally, the last straw happened, and so he and his wife and two small children essentially walked all the way from El Salvador to the U.S. border. They took buses at some points, but it was months of traveling. He came with nothing on his back, just the clothes he was wearing. He comes to the border with Texas. He crosses the bridge. His wife is holding the hand of their 10-year-old son, and he's holding his 4-year-old child in his arms. They come to the border station and say to the guard, "We're here for protection. We're seeking asylum. We're afraid for our lives." His son is taken from his arms, and he is told, "You're going back to El Salvador." The wife is then taken from him with the children. He does not see her again for 6 or 8 months. He refused to leave because he felt, "I'm going to die. I have nothing to lose." So he just sat there. He did like his own little sit-in. And eventually another guard came and said, "Okay, we'll take you in. We'll process you." He then was separated, this is during the family separation, he was separated from his wife and kids. The wife was separated from one of the kids. She was able to see her child in one of the cages in the facility, was separated for days, finally got the other child back. She and the two children were released on parole, went to California. My guy was flown to Boston, again, that's where his bed was, and I met him, and the first thing that happened when I met him is he just burst into tears and started sobbing from everything he'd been through. That is not uncommon. These people that we're representing are so distraught, and they're so grateful that a lawyer is standing up for them and willing to help them. So first he sobbed, and this was a big, beefy police officer, and then I worked with him for many, many months and developed his case and presented it to the judge, and he was granted asylum. And then he got on a Greyhound bus. We literally picked him up in Burlington, put him on a bus that day, and he spent 3 days straight, 3.5 days on a bus to California, and he was reunited with his wife and two kids. That was a long odyssey for him. But that's what's happening. I mean, these are the people that we have right here in our county jails. It's every day I meet new people, and what you see is that wherever there's a crisis in the world, wherever there's some political upheaval, we see those people in the jail. So we have, right now, there's Nicaraguans showing up because there's a lot of strife in Nicaragua. I've represented clients from Venezuela. We have clients from Eritrea, Nepal, Cameroon, you name it. Wherever there are problems in the world, we are seeing those people right here in Massachusetts in our county jails. Some of our clients don't qualify for asylum for one reason or another, but they might qualify for protection under the torture. And so we have we've gotten protection from clients under that relief. It's not a route to becoming a US citizen, but it does protect them from being deported. Cancellation of removal is something one can do. If you've lived here for 10 years or 7 years continuously, even if you're not legal, you were not a legal permanent resident when you started your 10 years, if you can show that you had no crimes of significance in a 10-year period, and there is a person here in the US who's dependent upon you, like a disabled child or relative, parent, you may be able to get lawful status. And so we also represent people who are seeking habeas corpus, and that means if they've been in jail for more than 6 months after they've been ordered removed, and our government cannot get travel documents to send them back to their home country, they have the right under the US Constitution. They're protected. They have the right against indefinite detention, and so we will file a case in the US District Court, the federal court in Boston, and seek to have them released. And here's my example of habeas corpus. I met a guy in jail. He was Vietnamese. He was half Vietnamese. His mother was Vietnamese. His father was a US soldier in Vietnam. He and his father and his mother met in 1970 or so in Vietnam. His father was African-American soldier. His parents were together for several years, and then the Vietnam War ended. The father went back to the United States and lost touch with the mother. The son grew up in Vietnam. He looks like an African-American man with some Asian features. He grew up in Vietnam. He was treated terribly because obviously the war did not come out well for the United States, and he suffered a lot, and the US government in 1990 allowed Amerasians, they're called, to come to the US as refugees. He came to the US with his mother and half siblings. They were settled by the refugee agency in Vermont, Burlington, Vermont. He does not speak English. He had an unfortunate crime. He pled guilty to something he didn't do. There was no translator in court, but that crime was enough to cause him to be deported, to get a deportation order. So he's sitting in jail here, but our government can't send him back to Vietnam because Vietnam would not recognize him as a citizen. He was flown by our government to Georgia while he was in detention, and there's a Vietnamese embassy in Georgia, and the Vietnamese embassy staff said he was not really Vietnamese because his father was a US soldier, and he was his blood, so they were not going to take him back. He's then released, and he finally gets to go back to his mother, who's this tiny little Vietnamese woman. We have now undone the conviction that he experienced. We have undone it because he did not have an interpreter, and the judge recognized that as a flaw, like a constitutional flaw in the proceedings. So that has been vacated, and now we are in the process of, it's not up there, but filing a motion to rescind the removal order so we can stay with his mother here. But anyway, those are examples of the types of cases we're seeing right here in our facilities in Massachusetts.
Very good array of examples.
Representing children, there are many, many children. If you go to the JFK Federal Building on any day when the immigration court is open, you will see tons of children. Sometimes they're with parents, sometimes they're with guardians, sometimes they're just kids by themselves, and they are going in front of the judges, and they usually don't speak English, so they get headphones put on so an interpreter can explain what's happening. Sometimes kids are the beneficiaries of their parents' asylum application if their parents are here, but often they are here without parents because they fled abuse, abandonment, or neglect by their parents. And so if they can get a lawyer to help them, they go to the county probate and family court in Massachusetts and get an order that they have been subject to abuse, abandonment, or neglect, and they can't be reunified with their parents. If they can get that order, then they can apply for what's called special immigrant juvenile status. So we actually we represent a number of children in the SIJ, we call it SIJ process. Recently, however, the administration has really put a block on approving SIJ applications, so we're not seeing our clients get approved. They're basically they're either on hold and not getting decisions, or they're being denied if they're essentially between ages 18 and 21.
Yes.
And that is going to lead to more litigation.
It already has.
We're waiting for. There are also lots of women in immigration court, women who have fled domestic violence and gang violence with their children. The Attorney General, so going back to how law is made in the immigration courts, as Susan said, fall under the Department of Justice, which is led by the Attorney General. And the Attorney General can issue opinions that govern the law that's applied by the immigration judges. Attorney General Jeff Sessions issued an opinion called Matter of AB last year that basically said women who are victims of domestic violence in general are not entitled to protection under the asylum law. And there was also what we call dictum on the side. He said also applicants fleeing gang violence are generally not to be accorded asylum, don't meet the requirements. And essentially it's, well, I don't want to distill down Jeff Sessions' motivations, but the reasoning is that domestic violence and gang violence is the result of allegedly private conduct, not government conduct, so it's not persecution. So we have, as lawyers, we have had to be creative to think about how we do believe that many of our clients are entitled to asylum, because the conduct is not, one of the tests for asylum is whether the government is willing and able to control the actions of private actors. And in this case, we know in Central America that there is absolutely no effort by the government to control gang violence or domestic violence because it's part of the culture, and there's huge amounts of corruption. So we have actually still been successful in representing women in the immigration court. One of the arguments is that women are members of families, and therefore they're members of a social group, and they are targeted because of their status as members of those families. But being lawyers these days, with the changing policies of the administration, we have to constantly think about the theories and the strategies of what will work and what will not work. This was yours.
Oh.
This is from the beginning.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so Jeff says it's no longer the Attorney General, but he instituted this zero tolerance policy of criminally prosecuting asylum, people across the border and request asylum. I alluded to this before. It hasn't always been the case that every administration has treated people in the same circumstances the same way. This is a choice that a government makes. So this is what's happening. Under the second term of President Obama's administration, particularly in the second half, the years 5, 6, 7, and 8 of his administration, he actually had changed the posture of what the government was doing to focus much more on immigrants with criminal histories and not people seeking asylum. So it was a very different approach to things. The current approach is a very punitive, aggressive approach. Zero tolerance. It doesn't matter the basis upon which someone is asking. Everyone's being treated more or less the same way. You know, maybe in Massachusetts they're doing a better job of segregating immigrants from the general criminal population in the detention centers and jails, but in other parts of the country, people are being mixed together in those places. And the numbers of people in this country that are being detained has just skyrocketed since this current administration. On one hand, you've got Customs and Border Protection at the borders, especially at the southern border, who, until this Remain in Mexico policy went into effect, had just been processing people and detaining them. So just like everyone who came and asked was just admitted for, purposes of trying to make their case and detained. And so you had that coupled with the position of the Trump administration that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, was given a mission during the first week of President Trump's administration in January of 2017. A very significant memo was issued by the president called enforcing immigration in the homeland, in the interior of the country. So you have the borders with CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and then the enforcement inside the interior of the country with this very much stepped up enforcement mission, carrying out raids and searches and going to courthouses, including to cases where domestic violence cases are being heard in a family court and all these places, and they're patrolling and looking for people who might not be documented or have an issue, and they're picking up people everywhere. So between the borders and the interior of the country, the numbers of people that are being detained in the country has just really increased dramatically. And because so many people have been detained, the dockets of the immigration courts has just ballooned. So it's just so different from how it was before. So we have over 800,000 pending immigration cases in court in the country right now. The average wait time, like Irene said, has just grown exponentially. So the non-detained cases, regular immigration defense cases can go to, 2 years or more. And affirmative asylum cases, people who aren't detained but have entered with a valid visa and requested asylum. The wait time right now for asylum cases averages 3 to 5 years to have the case heard by an asylum officer. So different administrations handle immigration differently. We happen to have an extremely enforcement-oriented administration right now, and we're seeing the effects of that,
Although a lot, in fairness to President Obama,
Yeah.
I don't know if this is a lot of this happened with President Obama. So
It did.
there still were detention facilities and horrible conditions and people getting, picked up, and it was not a bed of roses.
No, that's true. But the numbers have increased. And the way the law is being interpreted is significantly different. President Obama actually deported a lot of people, but they did change the policy halfway through his term to focus more on people with criminal histories rather than other people. So you want to talk about how people can help?
Yes. So if you're interested in helping, some of you might be wondering what you can do to help. Here are different ideas. And also there's a notepad at the back if you'd like to volunteer, but legal services organizations need money to pay the lawyers to go in and represent people in detention. So if you're inclined to give money, if you have money to give and you're inclined to help, that is.
People who might like.
Yeah. Donate gift cards. So one of my experiences that when I pick up people, they are released from the ICE building in Burlington, Mass. They might have come out of, say, Eritrea, and they came to the U.S. with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and they have absolutely nothing else. They need help. They are completely dependent on charity. I have taken many clients directly to CVS so they can buy shampoo and soap and deodorant. So, we love having gift cards donated so we can hand our clients gift cards so they can buy basic supplies. People need clothing. They need, for example, my guy who, My client from El Salvador, the police officer who basically walked from El Salvador in one set of clothes, he was so mortified when I told him I was going to pick him up in Burlington, Mass, and he was going to be wearing those same clothes because even though he was in a prison uniform for 6 months, nobody does the laundry. Like, he took off his clothes, put them in a bag, and then put on a prison uniform, and then when he was released, he had to put on those ripped, stinking clothes when he was released. So we greeted him with fresh clothes. So we need clothing donated. People also need housing. So a lot of people get out and they have nowhere to live because they've just come from halfway across the globe and thrown themselves on the mercy of our country for protection. So housing is one of the most difficult things that we face, trying to help our clients find a place to live. If you're bilingual, we are always looking for interpreters of every different language you can imagine. And we also need people to translate documents because we at the PAIR Project, we're a nonprofit, we can't afford to pay interpreters and translators, so we're always looking for volunteers with different language skills. Something like accompanying immigrants to medical appointments, that is something very basic. We have a lot of clients who just don't go to the doctor, even though they need to, because they don't know how to get there. If you have professional services to offer, if you're a lawyer, or if you have, you're a tax advisor, who knows, tax advisor, you can do all sorts of services, provide services for free. You could donate your services. And we invite you to like the PAIR Project on Facebook, and then you can find out about events and other things that are important to the immigrant community. And again, there's a pad on the back. If you'd like to put your name down, contact info and what you can offer, we're happy to circle back with you. Questions?
I just want to point out that we have a couple of bins here, downstairs and upstairs by the reference desk, from the Boston Center for Refugee Health and Human Rights, which you can put donations in. And they're already starting to build up, but more is better.
Right. So questions, more questions? Anybody? Yes.
Well, you didn't mention that some of these asylum seekers do not have any family here, so if they're on probation, they're out on bond, where do they go?
Right, so one of the requirements to be released on parole or bond is to have a sponsor. So if they don't have anybody, they will not be released. They will be held in detention. If they're successful, however, they will be released. And then the question is, where do they go? And so we've had clients that have not known anybody, and so we try to work with other charitable organizations to find housing, and they just start building their lives from scratch once they get out. It's hard. It's very hard.
Yes.
Is the criminalization of asylum seekers against treaties that the United States has signed?
You mean criminalization by putting them in detention? You mean?
What you described?
Yeah. Housing them in jails while they wait for their cases. Not initially, but this is where we get to arguments about if you keep someone beyond a humane period of time, does it violate the Constitution or other treaties and things like this. So there are cases now that have been brought in federal court that many have been brought challenging the ability to hold asylum seekers in detention. A lot of these issues are going to end up at the Supreme Court. The emergency declaration that the president recently declared, after Congress refused his request to, raise the funds for the wall, and he decided to declare an emergency in order to get the funds. That's been, that's being litigated in federal court. Many different things about how we treat asylum applicants and people, immigrants in detention and immigrants seeking relief, are being litigated now in different federal courts all over the country, and they're going up on appeal, and many of them are going to end up going up to the Supreme Courts. I think we'll see if the Supreme Court agrees to take some of the cases or not take some of the cases. Certainly the emergency declaration, I think, quite certainly is going to end up at the Supreme Court because it speaks to the whole issue of separation of powers in the country, and I think the court's going to end up taking that case.
Is holding asylum seekers in Mexico also being challenged?
Absolutely. There's a case that was recently filed in federal district court in San Francisco, challenging the holding of asylum seekers in Mexico as violating the Refugee Act of 1980, that's a United States law, and also the international conventions on refugees, human rights conventions, in the UN convention. And the arguments are many. Don't know what's going to end up happening, but this is what I was thinking about when I was there a couple of weeks ago, to the point about what a difference it makes if someone has a lawyer, has access to counsel. If you're seeking a benefit under United States law, you need a United States qualified lawyer to advise you, you know, if you're lucky enough to get one. You're not going to find one in Mexico. And when I spoke to people there, and I only had time to listen to some of the people's stories, but of the people who were approaching me and clinging to me and begging me to tell them what was going to happen to them when they came with their children, like clinging to their legs and asking me all these heartbreaking questions, I asked them to tell me their stories. They were from El Salvador, they were from Guatemala and Honduras. And the ones that I spoke to, they described with particularity the things that had happened to them. And as someone who knows a lot of asylum, I didn't hear all their stories, but the ones I heard, I knew were bona fide sounding asylum claims that would likely be approvable if they could present their cases, or at least they would have a chance. They would have a chance to have an approval. But they didn't have anyone to talk to, and I was the first lawyer they'd ever met, and they were being kept on the Mexican side. And Juarez is a dangerous place, you know, and so is Tijuana and a lot of these border areas where there's a lot of violent crime, there's a lot of drugs. So if they're not in the shelters and they have to leave, you know, one of the arguments is it's not a safe third country. You know, these places, this is not safe. You know, and they also don't have access to counsel. So the lawsuit that is challenging this policy is framed around violation of U.S. law and in the inability to obtain counsel. So no access to counsel. So no advice about, you know, what the law, U.S. law provides. Yeah.
Not stated in one of the bullets, it's about earning capacity. Can folks in these various categories go out and work at a business in Massachusetts while they're out on bond?
You want to speak to that?
All right, so there's all sorts of different ways that immigrants can get legal work authorization before their case is resolved. So somebody who has applied for asylum, after 6 months they qualify, they become eligible to apply for work authorization. It's very complicated, but there are all sorts of different ways that people can apply for work authorization, legal work authorization, before their claim for immigration relief has been heard. There are many categories of people that are not allowed to work legally, and that puts a huge strain on them, because if they're here under color of law, they've been released on bond, they have to support themselves, and what are they going to do if they're not legally authorized to work? It puts them in a tough position, but it's a real mix. Some people are able, based on the relief they're seeking, some people are able to get work authorizations, and some people are not, because they're, you know, they're going down a different avenue towards ultimately having the merits of their case heard.
We have a double-edged sword in our immigration system right now, which is that you have to wait a minimum of 6 months after submitting your asylum application to request work authorization. Then you don't actually get the card for 3 or 4 more months after that. So it's about 9 or 10 months from the time you've sought relief to the time you get permission to work. And if you work without authorization, you're deportable for that. So it's like a gotcha thing. It's very difficult to be in compliance unless you have found an organization that will help you, provide for you, or someone who can, you know, befriend you and assist you financially, or you have family that's, you know, family or friends that can help you out. So it's like we're giving people, you know, mixed messages with the way our system has been set up, because, you know, it's very difficult to survive for 9 or 10 months if you're not allowed to work. They all want to work. Everyone that I've met wants to work, but they're just not allowed to until they get their card, you know.
journalists have not been allowed to stay, and there are First Amendment issues about that.
Yes.
And I wondered
Yes.
how you felt and what you experienced there in
Yeah.
terms of your own safety and
Right.
whether
That's a-
lawyers are being welcomed there or not.
It's a great question. I also have been recently hearing about what's been happening. Some of the people who have tried to go and give them, and you do need, if you're going to do work in another country, you need a work permit to work in that other country. So it's true. I was just visiting for one day, but I wasn't stationed trying to help people, and so it is tricky to give people advice when you're actually performing work that might be in contravention of a country's immigration laws, right? So you've got that issue, right? And then the journalists, the things that have been happening to journalists, I have very strong opinions about that. I think it's absolutely illegal what they've done to the journalists, putting them on lists just because they found out that journalists were going to Mexico to cover the immigrant, situation down there. And, that's a different situation. They're not lawyers. But it's tricky. It's tricky because, the way the system is now working, that setting up this remain in Mexico policy, it's, in my view, I have a very particular view, and I'm not going to hold back and be completely neutral about it. I believe what I believe, and I believe that it's, entirely politically motivated, and it's set up to make it impossible for a lot of immigrants to ever get a status in the United States for all of these different reasons. And it's working. It's starting to work. People are, some of them are giving up. Lawyers can't access people properly. It's dangerous. So fewer lawyers are able to go, or some are scared to go because they don't know what's going to happen to them. But it's just not viable or practical to advise people across the border when they really should be, seeking the advice in the country whose laws they're seeking protection from. It's just like an impossible situation. It's very, very difficult to manage. So, we'll see if it gets upheld, this remain in Mexico. It may or it may not, I don't know. But it's certainly created a lot of problems for the people who are stuck there, for the people who want to help them, and it's not easy. What I would like to do is Skype something remotely with, I'm talking to the shelter that's run by the diocese that I was at, where I want to see if we can Skype in at least, for an hour every week or something like that to give them some know your rights information. If we could set up a computer, and then we'll be here legally working in the U.S., not exposing anybody to violations of immigration law in another country. But these are obstacles that have to be overcome, yeah.
There are many ports of entry into the U.S., and so people are figuring out where the blockages are and trying to go to the other ports of entry, because I have had clients who have come through kind of obscure ports of entry, and they've said they're talking to each other. There's a lot of communication going on outside of the U.S. about how to get into the U.S. So I have a client that went to a very particular quiet little bridge in Texas and presented himself for asylum at that bridge, and he did not have to wait. There was no backup because he went I actually went on Google Maps today to figure out where it was.
Yeah.
It was very off the beaten track, but he made it, and he got in. So.
Well, there's the policy is they've set up these very specific legal places where you're allowed to make your request to come in. And it's a very long border, and there are very few of these places. And then on top of that, they're metering and not letting people actually make the requests. They're saying, sorry, come back another day, sorry, come back another day. So people can't legally request asylum, and they're saying, I just want to ask for asylum. I'm not trying to sneak in the country. I want to ask for asylum. So they're not letting them do it. So they're forcing people to try to do some very, very dangerous things and swim across the Rio Grande and find other places to cross. So they can then turn themselves in if they could come across someone. The border patrol agent will be maybe driving along and find them like in the desert or whatever. They just say, here I am, I want asylum. They're not trying to get in without being seen. They want to be seen. Most of these people, they want to be seen. They just want to ask for asylum. But they're being forced into this situation by the government.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Is that new then?
Yeah.
Has that ever happened in the U.S.?
Never happened before. This is new. Last was happened in Tijuana, and now they're going to extend it to Juarez over the next month or two.
What does that mean, metering?
Metering
Oh.
means we can only take 27 people today.
But it sounds very random by day too, that it may be 10 one day and 5 in one place, and so from what I've read, it sounds like
It is very
it's not,
ra-
it's not consistent across.
It is so disorganized.
But is there any number? I know the U.S. sets like a number for refugees, which is dramatically
Down to
dropped.
theoretically 30,000 as opposed to 110,000 2 years ago. But even 30,000 we're not letting in. They're not processing refugees in this administration. Yeah.
Is there enough? Do they set a number on asylum?
No, there's no limit.
So it's and do we know whether, because it's just, all this furor around this right at the moment, do we know whether the number, I know there's been spikes and, but sort of large scale, do we know whether the number is
Way down. It's
dramatically
like
high on
30,000 or
asylum seekers? Or?
Right. So what I have heard is that numbers are way down.
Yeah.
Way down. It's much lower than it has been. And let me give you another example of a client in terms of this metering. I have a client that came from Africa. He'd been tortured by his own government when he was 17 years old. The most sympathetic client I've had. Well, they're all incredibly sympathetic. This guy was extremely sympathetic. He was tortured by his own government when he was 17. He managed to spend 5 years escaping and hiding until he could get enough money to try to get to the U.S. So he came through Africa. He got a flight to Brazil. He and some others took buses, boats, all the way from Brazil to Tijuana. So it took 3 months or something, and he was afraid for his life the entire time. They had nowhere to sleep at night, so they were sleeping under trees. They didn't have any food. He thought he was going to die every day. He gets to the border in Tijuana to claim asylum, and he went up to the Mexican side. I haven't been there, but he was given a number. It was like a white slip that had a number on it. And every day he went up to the border to see if his number was called, or if his number was on a board, because if it was, that was the day he would get to the U.S. border station and could seek asylum. And so it took a month. He stayed in a hotel, like a rooming house with a bunch of people in Tijuana every night. And for 1 month, they checked every day. And after that month, his number was up. He came in. He was processed. He passed the credible fear interview. And lo and behold, he ends up in Boston. And now the clothes that he wore all the way across the world are in the back of my car.
Wow,
He's still in detention. But
yeah.
he was one of the people who could not believe. He was so excited to see snow falling. He's behind bars,
Yeah.
looking out the window.
I think we're going to have to wrap up soon. We take a couple more. Yeah.
Can you talk about the immigration court process and what laws they operate under and where appeals can be heard? It's not the state law.
Right, it's
and
federal.
It's federal law, but it's particular.
Yeah.
But it's
Immigration law.
Yeah.
So in a nutshell, if you lose in the immigration court, you can appeal to the Bureau of Immigration Appeals, which is also within the Department of Justice. If you lose there, you can appeal out to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. So that gets you into the real federal court system. And then theoretically, you could go to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. But in our court in Boston, the law of the land in our jurisdiction is the First Circuit. So we actually get real case law from the First Circuit that we can apply and argue in our immigration cases in front of the immigration judges. So there's a little comfort in I always find a little comfort in that, except the First Circuit, it's mixed.
First
The law
Circuit's-
is mixed.
Yeah. The lack of discretion that immigration judges can exercise now is an issue that is much more serious than it ever was before, because under this administration, they have issued policy memoranda to the immigration judges from the Department of Justice, from the Attorney General, to limit their ability to make decisions the way they would want to make them and require them to make decisions along certain lines that they might not actually want to make. And so you're going to see much more in the news in the coming months and however long it takes. There's a movement afoot in this country to make the immigration judges Article 1 federal judges like every other kind of judge. But it's an uphill battle. So, right now they're just, in the immigration, under the Executive Office for Immigration Review, which is part of the Department of Justice, which has its mission to prosecute the immigrants. So there's really an imbalance there that needs to be corrected. So there's a lot of movement right now to bring this into the public consciousness and to urge change in the system.
And most of the judges on the court here are former prosecutors, immigration prosecutors for the Department of Justice. They're not neutrals. They're not neutral starting out, getting on the bench.
Are they processing any more volume cases in response to the bill?
Yeah.
I mean, so it's
Volume is-
it's just not.
They're trying to. They're trying to.
They've been given quotas for the first time as well under this administration. Never happened before. They have to do a certain number of cases, and if they can't get the cases done in the time frame, they'll be fired. So, yeah, it's something that never happened before in this country. It's brand new. I mean, it's brand new in the last, 8 months or something. Yeah.
Has that policy been instituted and judges been fired under that policy you just referred to?
I think some might have been fired or threatened to be fired, but I don't have the statistics on that. They also have instituted quotas on denials for immigration benefits at USCIS, which is the area in which I operate mostly, which is visas. Most of my regular clients are, professionals, business people, inventors, scientists, doctors, and things like that. And I do the asylum work on the side, unlike Irene, who's just, God bless her, doing asylum work every single day. But in that context, denial quotas for the first time ever in the history of our country have also been instituted. And denials have gone up by 76% in certain types of immigration benefits, like work visas and things like that. It's very different than it was.
Question about ICE. So ICE is part of the federal system, and ICE is able to enter workplaces, courts, is this all correct? State office buildings, public schools?
Sometimes they need a warrant, but yeah, it's they've been doing that. Not across the board, but when they
A huge problem for some people is they go to court to defend a charge, a criminal charge. Oh, you're operating without a license, operating under the influence, domestic, whatever. They get charged with a crime, and they go to court to respond and to meet their legal obligations, and they're picked up by ICE on the steps of the courthouse, and they get put in detention, and they never get to defend themselves on the criminal charge. Sometimes a default could be entered against them, which is a deportable offense. So then they're in detention with a deportation order.
Are they able to enter public schools? I'm thinking about the K through 12 system and the public university system.
So they can.
No,
They
not without a warrant.
Yeah,
And it is our, for example, our public schools policy not to allow them without a warrant, because you don't have to.
Right.
If they have a warrant, it's holding.
A city like City of Boston is a sanctuary city. They can't go into city office buildings.
Right.
So there are some
It's-
restrictions.
It's jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Yeah.
So, you talk about Skyping and giving legal advice via Skype to people in Mexico. How are they able to, make them actionable? What do they do with the information you provide them?
Well,
From
we can
Mexico.
just give them basic know your rights information, not specific. It's just like if you're applying for asylum, you have a right to do this. Just basic things. That's all.
I'm afraid we have to stop.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Don't forget the volunteer sign-up sheet in the back.
Yes, please volunteer.
They enter the public library to